Ayesha, a woman in her mid-30s, lives in quiet loneliness while her husband Rohit frequently travels for work. Their once passionate marriage has faded into routine and emotional distance. When Rohit leaves for another business trip, Ayesha reconnects with Karan, a charming cousin figure from her past, who reignites a sense of attention and validation she hasn't felt in years. Inviting him over for lunch under innocent pretenses, the visit soon turns emotionally charged as shared memories, laughter, and subtle flirtation stir buried desires. Karan sees Ayesha not just as a wife or homemaker, but as a woman with unspoken needs. The emotional intimacy leads to a kiss, and by evening, a quiet betrayal unfolds between them. The next morning, Karan leaves a note, not of regret, but of recognition. Ayesha feels neither shame nor justification, only clarity. When Rohit returns, the distance between them is more evident than ever. She chooses not to confess, but she also no longer feels invisible. The affair doesn't fix her marriage, it awakens her to how deeply she has disappeared inside it. Ayesha's world remains outwardly unchanged, but internally, she knows she can't go back to being unseen. It wasn't love. But it was real. Ayesha stood by the kitchen window, holding her coffee mug close, watching the morning light spill across the counter. The silence pressed against her temples like a slow ache. Rohit had left for Mumbai just before dawn, another 5-day corporate conference, another week of messages reduced to updates and goodnight emojis. She walked to the dining table, sat down, and opened her phone. One unread message from Rohit: boarding now. Take care. No kiss, no heart. Just efficiency. 7 years of marriage, and everything felt like a checklist. The first 2 years had been intoxicating, late-night drives, spontaneous getaways, whispers in the dark. But now, intimacy had withered into routine. Conversations revolved around groceries, bills, or work schedules. He was always busy, always tired. She stopped asking for date nights. Stopped wearing the perfume he used to love. Ayesha glanced at the clock. 9:42 a.m. She had the entire day to herself and no one to share it with. She opened Instagram and mindlessly scrolled, fitness videos, reels of smiling couples, vacation pictures. Then her thumb froze on a familiar face. Karan. He was smiling, leaning on a motorcycle, wind in his hair. He hadn't changed much, same mischief in his eyes, same laid-back charm. Ayesha hesitated, then tapped the message icon. You're still posting these biker boy photos, she typed, adding a winking emoji. He replied within seconds. And you're still stalking them, huh? She laughed out loud, really laughed, for the first time in days. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally typed, I'm home alone this week. Rohit's out of town. Want to come by for lunch? There was a pause. Then came his reply. Tempting. I'll bring dessert. The tea sat forgotten between them. Karan leaned back on the sofa, one arm resting casually on the cushion, the other holding his cup. Ayesha sat across from him, legs tucked under her, cupping her mug with both hands like it could steady her pulse. The sunlight filtered in through the curtains, dust motes dancing between them. The silence, though unspoken, was thick with implication. You've made this place feel like home, he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. Warm. Lived in. I like it. It's quiet, she replied, too quickly. Sometimes too quiet. Karan's gaze lingered on her. You ever get lonely here? The question wasn't accusatory, just observant. But it settled like a stone between them. Ayesha looked down into her cup, then out the window. Sometimes, she admitted. Rohit's work keeps him busy. He's doing well, but it means a lot of travel. A lot of nights alone. Karan nodded. Yeah. I remember. He was always chasing the next promotion. She laughed softly. He caught it. And then another. I lost track somewhere in between. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the ceiling fan filled the space. Karan shifted, sitting up straighter. His tone softened. You were always meant for more than silence, Ayesha. The nickname startled her. No one had called her that in years. You remember that Diwali night, he continued, his voice lower now, as if afraid to stir the air. The rain, the dancing, the blackout. She smiled despite herself. I slipped on wet tiles and nearly broke my ankle. You were wild that night. Free. It was the first time I realized you weren't just big cousin Ayesha. You were something else. Ayesha didn't respond. Her throat felt dry. She stood abruptly, gathering the empty cups. I'll get dessert, she said, voice too steady. In the kitchen, she closed her eyes and gripped the counter. Her heart thudded erratically. This wasn't part of the plan. Lunch, laughter, maybe a few harmless compliments. Not this. This dangerous nostalgia, this tugging at something she had buried long ago. When she returned, Karan was flipping through an old photo album that had been on the bookshelf. He looked up and grinned. You kept this? She nodded. Some things are hard to throw away. He patted the cushion beside him. Come on. Let's cringe at our hairstyles together. She hesitated, then sat. Their arms brushed. Neither moved. They flipped through the pages, their laughter rising and falling. Then, in a photo of them as teenagers, her in a pink salwar, him in a loud shirt, he pointed. That's the night I almost kissed you. Ayesha stared at the image. She remembered. The glow of fairy lights, the whispered dares, the electricity of almost. You didn't, she said quietly. You stopped me, he replied, just as softly. But I never really forgot that moment. The words settled over her skin like heat. He turned to face her fully now. What are we doing, Ayesha? She didn't answer. Her fingers toy. Ayesha woke to the scent of sandalwood lingering in the room and the faintest indentation beside her on the bed. The sheets were still warm, the room dim with the fading light of late evening. For a moment, disoriented, she thought Rohit had come home early. But then she saw the half-empty wine glass on the nightstand, and everything came rushing back. Karan was gone. On the pillow, neatly placed, was a folded note written in his familiar, looping handwriting. Last night wasn't a mistake. It was a reminder, you are still alive. Don't let the silence swallow you. K. She held the paper tightly, pressing it to her chest as if it could still carry the heat of his hand. There was no regret in his words. And, disturbingly, not much in her heart either. Only a heavy, aching clarity. She sat up, pulling the sheets around her, suddenly aware of the silence again. But now, it had shifted, no longer hollow, but full of conflict. She had crossed a line. And yet, instead of shame, she felt a strange calm. By the time Rohit returned 2 days later, the house had been returned to its pristine state. The candles were boxed away, the wine glasses washed and hidden. Ayesha had washed the sheets twice, changed the covers, and scrubbed the kitchen out of habit more than necessity. When he entered, suitcase rolling behind him, Rohit looked exhausted. Flight was a mess, he said, dropping his bag near the door. They lost one of my bags. I'm starving. She hugged him, briefly. He kissed her cheek and went to the kitchen, rummaging for leftovers. There was no spark, no suspicion in his eyes, just routine. Predictable. Safe. I got you something, he added, pulling a wrapped box from his carry-on. It was a small bottle of perfume, one she'd once mentioned in passing years ago. She smiled. Thank you. As they sat at the table, eating quietly, she studied him. He hadn't changed. Still organized, still composed. Still miles away even when sitting right in front of her. She wondered what he would say if she told him the truth. If she described how Karan had touched her like she mattered, not just physically, but emotionally, intimately. How his gaze didn't pass through her, but stopped and stayed. But she said nothing. Some truths didn't need telling. Not because they didn't matter, but because they would shatter too much. That night, Rohit slid into bed beside her and turned off the lamp. His breathing settled into a familiar rhythm. He didn't reach for her. Ayesha lay still, staring at the ceiling. She felt suspended between two worlds. The one she'd built carefully, and the one that had cracked open in a single afternoon. She didn't romanticize what happened with Karan. It wasn't love. It wasn't even passion in the traditional sense. It was an intersection of need, timing, and unspoken history. It was real. And for her, it was enough to shake everything. In the days that followed, life returned to its regular patterns. Rohit went back to work. They shared breakfast. She watered the plants, took phone calls from her mother, and posted photos of sunsets on social media. From the outside, everything looked the same. But inside, something had shifted. Ayesha moved through her days differently. She noticed people more, how they spoke, how they listened. She paid attention to moments when she felt truly present, and moments when she vanished inside her own life. She didn't contact Karan again. He didn't try either. There was an unspoken understanding that whatever had bloomed between them lived in its own sealed-off space. Untouched, unchaste. One evening, while folding laundry, she paused over the kurti she'd worn that day. Sky blue, soft, familiar. She held it for a long time before folding it carefully and placing it at the bottom of the drawer. That part of her story was over. But not forgotten. Ayesha had not solved anything. Her marriage was still quiet. Her days still patterned. But now, she carried the weight of her choice, not with pride, not with guilt, but with awareness. She had betrayed Rohit. But more deeply, she had betrayed the version of herself that accepted silence as normal. The act with Karan had not saved her. But it had awakened her. She did not yet know what would come next, if she would confront Rohit, if she would leave, if she would simply endure. But she knew now that something inside her had been starved. And for one brief, fragile moment, it had been fed. She walked to the window, the sky outside streaked with the last blush of evening. Below, the city buzzed. Cars, voices, lives colliding and continuing. Behind her, Rohit. Voice called out faintly from the living room. Something about dinner. She replied without turning. Then, she closed the curtain.